You're listening to WarScope Audio, where we bring you a clear-eyed account of the world's most dangerous conflicts. This is part 1 of our extended coverage of the Iran-Israel escalation of June 2025, a moment that marks the most direct military confrontation between the two countries in modern history. For decades, Iran and Israel have been locked in a quiet, often invisible conflict. They've engaged through proxies, intelligence agencies, cyber units, and foreign alliances. Iran backed Hezbollah and Hamas. Israel responded with covert strikes in Syria, Iraq, and even cyber operations like the famous Stuxnet virus in 2010. But in June 2025, the gloves came off. On June 9, a series of intelligence leaks suggested that Iran had enriched uranium beyond 84%. The closest it's come to weapons-grade purity. Iran denied the accusations. Israel, however, publicly stated that it would not allow a hostile regime to approach nuclear breakout. International negotiators urged restraint, but the signs were growing clear. Something was about to happen. On June 11, satellite imagery detected a buildup of Israeli air power near bases in Negev and northern Galilee. Western analysts reported the movement of multiple squadrons of F-35 Iadirs, Israel's most advanced stealth fighter. Late that night, the U.S. quietly repositioned one of its carrier strike groups in the eastern Mediterranean, just in case. Then came June 12, at 2:47 a.m. local time. Air raid sirens began sounding across central Iran. A coordinated wave of Israeli strikes had begun, targeting key Iranian military and nuclear facilities in what Israeli media would later call Operation Rising Lion. More than 300 precision-guided munitions rained down on carefully selected locations. The strikes were not random. They were targeted at Iran's most valuable military assets. The Natanz nuclear facility, long monitored by the IAEA, was struck in multiple locations, including above-ground air vents and suspected underground enrichment halls. Missiles hit Kermanshah's ballistic missile factory, the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, and the Imam Ali base near Mashhad. Tehran's air defense system responded, but not fast enough. Some Iranian S-300 batteries activated, but Israel had already deployed a wave of small, fast, radar-evading drones ahead of the main assault. These drones, many of them quadcopters with eye navigation, were used to jam and disrupt anti-aircraft radar. Several Iranian radar domes were rendered blind before the jets arrived. The damage was significant. Satellite imagery from the next day showed blackened crater rings, collapsed buildings, and scattered debris fields stretching hundreds of meters. Rescue crews were on the scene for hours, digging through rubble, while state television remained silent for nearly 12 hours before acknowledging enemy action. At 5 a.m., Iranian news finally confirmed what the world already knew: Iran had been hit. The statement was brief and vague, saying that enemy forces conducted air operations on several military-adjacent facilities, and that Iran reserves the right to respond at a time of its choosing. But as international observers scrambled for clarity, Western media filled in the blanks. Leaks from Allied intelligence sources confirmed that Mossad had established multiple remote drone launch platforms inside Iranian borders, particularly in western provinces near Kurdish territory. These bases, operated via satellite uplink and likely aided by local collaborators, were instrumental in disabling radar sites hours before the actual strike. Iran's leadership met in emergency session. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, President Ibrahim Raisi, and the heads of the IRGC and Artesh convened at an undisclosed location outside Tehran. What followed was a rare moment of strategic silence. For nearly 20 hours, Iran said nothing further, but then came the response. At 10:22 p.m. on June 12, the same day, Iran launched its counter-offensive. The operation, codenamed True Promise 3, involved dozens of ballistic missiles, launched from deep inside Iranian territory, and over 50 drone incursions aimed at Israeli airbases, cities, and infrastructure nodes. The Iron Dome, Israel's premier air defense shield, went into full activation. Sirens wailed over Ashdod, Ashkelon, Beersheva, and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Interceptor missiles streaked into the sky, creating waves of sonic booms and blinding mid-air flashes as they collided with Iranian warheads. Still, a few broke through. 2 buildings in southern Tel Aviv were damaged by drone debris. A logistics hub in Ashdod caught fire. And, tragically, 7 civilians were killed and nearly 50 injured in a residential neighborhood hit by a missile fragment that had not been fully intercepted. The Israeli government responded with another wave of air patrols and the emergency mobilization of 15,000 reservists. Anti-drone defenses were placed in Eilat, the Golan Heights, and near Jerusalem. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a national address at dawn, stating, "Israel will act decisively and proportionately, without fear and without hesitation. Those who strike us will be struck in return." Meanwhile, across the region, tension rippled outward. Jordan closed its airspace temporarily. Iraq's green zone was placed under lockdown. Gulf nations including the UAE and Qatar issued travel warnings for Lebanon and Syria. International air carriers rerouted flights to avoid Iranian and Israeli airspace. Oil prices began to rise. The morning after the exchange, the streets of Tehran were quieter than usual. Traffic flowed, but with noticeable tension. Government buildings flew black flags. Schools remained closed. The Iranian Ministry of Defense issued a statement declaring that the Zionist regime had crossed the red line, and promised that further military options were under active consideration. By 11 a.m. on June 13, additional retaliatory actions had already begun. Iran launched another wave of drones, this time aimed not only at Israel's southern cities, but also at military installations in the Negev desert. Meanwhile, cyber units within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps initiated coordinated digital attacks on Israeli financial networks, attempting to disrupt electronic payment systems, government servers, and telecommunications. Israel's National Cyber Directorate quickly responded, rerouting traffic and activating emergency firewall protocols. In Tel Aviv, screens at train stations briefly flickered before being restored. There were no major system breakdowns. But the message was clear. This battle wasn't just in the skies. In northern Israel, the Lebanese border grew increasingly tense. Israeli forces noticed heightened radio chatter among Hezbollah units near the Litani River. Though Hezbollah had not yet engaged, Israel deployed artillery and drone reconnaissance to the frontier as a precaution. Western analysts speculated that Iran was pressuring Hezbollah to stay quiet, avoiding a full-scale multi-front war. At the same time, the Israeli Air Force continued its high-tempo operations. Over the next 48 hours, more than a dozen sorties flew deep into Iranian airspace, hitting suspected drone depots in Ilam province and targeting underground facilities used for missile storage near Yazd. One such strike, filmed by a civilian on a rooftop and uploaded anonymously, showed what appeared to be a deep penetration bomb detonating underground, a signal that Israel was using advanced bunker-busting munitions. In Washington, D.C., the U.S. Secretary of State addressed the press. "We urge both parties to step back and consider the long-term consequences." He said, "We support Israel's right to defend itself. But we must also avoid regional destabilization that would endanger millions." While avoiding direct criticism, his tone reflected a growing concern that the confrontation was nearing a tipping point. In Geneva, emergency consultations began at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Inspectors had not been able to reach the Natanz site since the strike. A temporary loss of communication raised fears that nuclear material might have been exposed. Iran insisted that safeguards remained intact, but refused external access. The IAEA issued a statement calling for full transparency. Meanwhile, Iran's economy began to shudder. The Tehran Stock Exchange fell 4.3% in one day. The rial lost nearly 9% of its value against the dollar. Merchants in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, normally resistant to political fluctuations, shuttered stores for the afternoon. In whispered conversations, citizens expressed frustration not just with Israel, but with their own leadership's failure to prevent the strike. On Israeli soil, public opinion remained polarized. In Tel Aviv and Haifa, rallies were held both in support of the government and against further escalation. Some citizens waved flags and chanted slogans calling for national unity. Others carried signs that read, "We will not be Syria," urging the government to avoid entanglement in prolonged military conflict. The humanitarian situation also began to shift. Iran's Red Crescent issued a call for blood donors. Israeli hospitals went on mass casualty alert. Border communities in both countries activated civilian emergency protocols, with families instructed on shelter drills and food rationing. International NGOs started quietly preparing for refugee flows if escalation continued. What went less noticed, but not less important, was the rising tempo of covert operations. Reports emerged of explosions in western Iran, in areas not officially struck by Israeli aircraft. Locals described seeing small drones and hearing pops at night. Intelligence analysts believe these were likely sabotage actions carried out by infiltrated teams or by local cells sympathetic to Israel. Back in Iraq, the Green Zone was placed on a gray alert. American forces stationed near Al-Assad Air Base were instructed to limit movement. The U.S. Embassy temporarily suspended consular operations in Baghdad. Kurdish intelligence sources warned of potential Iranian-backed militia activity near the Erbil airport, a potential proxy signal aimed at U.S. influence in the region. As global media attention grew, misinformation also proliferated. Dozens of manipulated videos began circulating online, some showing fake footage of warplanes. Others using AI-generated audio clips to mimic military leaders announcing retaliations that never happened. Israeli cybersecurity firms traced some of the content to troll farms operating out of Eastern Europe, while Iranian authorities blamed Western disinformation designed to destabilize the region. Despite the chaos, a few voices of calm emerged. In Oman, a seasoned negotiator from the 2015 JCPOA talks offered to mediate new discussions. Egypt and Jordan urged strategic patience. Even Saudi Arabia, once a fierce rival of Iran, called for a ceasefire. Behind closed doors, backchannels began forming, but no one moved publicly yet. And still, the strikes continued. On June 14, Iranian missile units fired 2 salvos toward the Negev. While intercepted successfully, they marked the 6th consecutive day of engagement. Israel responded by striking radar stations near Tabas. A pattern began to emerge: tit for tat, strike for strike, word for word, each side unwilling to blink. And yet, neither side had declared formal war. That strange tension, of open military conflict without formal war, made diplomats nervous. It also complicated humanitarian law. Could aid agencies operate in bombed areas? Could third parties offer de-escalation? Or would even mediation be seen as taking sides? As of June 15, more than 70 lives had been lost across both countries. Hundreds were injured. Infrastructure in 6 provinces had been damaged. And still, the world watched, some with fear, some with calculation, some with silence. This was no longer a warning. This was a new phase. On June 16, the air grew heavier, not only in the skies over the Middle East but also in the diplomatic chambers of the world. Israel's military confirmed it had carried out additional precision strikes overnight, this time focused on Iranian drone manufacturing plants near Isfahan and a suspected cyber warfare command post located on the outskirts of Shiraz. Videos released from the scene showed plumes of black smoke rising above reinforced hangars, punctuated by the faint but chilling sounds of secondary explosions. Iran's response that day was more measured. Instead of missiles, it released a statement through the Supreme National Security Council declaring that its armed forces had achieved strategic deterrence and were now entering a position of calibrated vigilance. While not a declaration of ceasefire, the tone represented a subtle shift, a recognition that escalation without control risked backfiring both militarily and politically. That same afternoon, the Sultanate of Oman confirmed it had received non-official backchannel overtures from both parties. Though unnamed, diplomatic sources suggested that mid-level officials from Iran and Israel, possibly retired intelligence officers, had been in quiet contact via intermediaries in Europe and the Gulf. A window, however narrow, had opened. In Tel Aviv, the streets began to stir again. Schools remained closed in the south, but businesses in the central districts cautiously reopened. Cafes filled slowly. News tickers on public transit stations no longer reported incoming threats, but switched back to regular programming. The anxiety had not disappeared, but it had softened, like a storm cloud still visible but receding toward the horizon. Yet, beneath this surface stillness, both nations continued preparing for contingencies. In Tehran, long convoys of fueled trucks and mobile radar units moved eastward. In Israel, fresh concrete reinforcements were poured at military bases, and new Iron Dome launchers were discreetly installed along the northern border. The military knew better than to assume silence meant safety. On the global stage, a realignment began taking shape. The European Union convened a high-level security summit in Brussels. There, leaders debated not only how to contain this confrontation, but what it revealed about broader instability. The German chancellor stated plainly, if regional powers escalate with this level of technological precision, future wars may be faster than diplomacy can respond. In the United States, Bipartisan voices in Congress urged caution. Some called for more missile interceptors to be delivered to Israel. Others warned that regional entanglement could distract from commitments in Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific. President Harris issued a brief address, noting, "We encourage all parties to pursue security not through retaliation, but through negotiation, backed by global consensus and law." Meanwhile, social media across the world offered a window into civilian consciousness. On TikTok, videos of Iron Dome interceptions amassed millions of views. Iranian influencers posted nighttime footage of blackout drills and rooftop conversations about "what if" in Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew. Hashtags like #No More Missiles and #Our Children Sleep Too trended for days. It became clear, beyond governments, people were tired. Back in Iran, domestic political debates sharpened. Reformists argued that the loss of critical military infrastructure could have been avoided if diplomacy had been prioritized earlier. Hardliners insisted the strikes only validated Iran's strategic importance. The supreme leader gave a rare live address, not to call for war, but to urge national resilience and economic reform, a sign that even the most powerful institutions recognized the toll the past week had taken. Israel, too, felt the psychological impact. While military analysts praised the effectiveness of the strikes, some within the defense establishment warned that prolonged tension with Iran would further erode long-term deterrence. A leaked military intelligence memo described the risk of retaliation through proxies for years to come, especially in cyberspace, maritime routes, and economic sabotage. And then, a turning point. On June 17, both Israel and Iran independently scaled down air operations. No missiles were fired, no new strikes reported. Instead, a joint communiqué from Switzerland and Norway confirmed that neutral facilitators had established a crisis communication mechanism between the two sides, not a peace negotiation, but a signal relay system to avoid miscalculation. It wasn't peace, it wasn't even détente, but it was something better than war. On June 18, the United Nations finally passed a resolution condemning attacks on civilian infrastructure and calling for unrestricted IAEA access to all affected nuclear sites. The resolution was non-binding but received support from 14 of 15 Security Council members. Russia abstained. By June 19, oil prices stabilized. Maritime insurers lifted emergency premiums on Gulf shipping lanes. Iranian civilian flights resumed to several neighboring capitals. Israeli airlines reactivated routes to Cyprus and southern Europe. Still, the scars remain. Over 70 confirmed dead, thousands displaced, millions traumatized, billions in economic damage, and the knowledge, on both sides, that another spark could reignite the flame. That is the state of things as we conclude part 1 of our deep report on the Iran-Israel escalation of 2025. You've heard the timeline, you've followed the strikes, the responses, the costs, the signals, but what does it all mean strategically? What lessons can we learn from this confrontation? Where does deterrence end and disaster begin? In part 2, we'll change tone, less breaking news, more analysis, less tension, more insight, and yes, a bit of grounded, strategic sarcasm too, because sometimes, only a bit of wit can illuminate the absurdity of near-apocalypse decisions made behind closed doors. This is WarScope Audio. Stay tuned. Welcome back to WarScope Audio, where we don't just report on explosions, we decode what they mean. In part 2, we step out of the bunker and into the mind of military planners, strategists, and yes, a few overcaffeinated think tank analysts who can't decide if the next war will be fought with drones or emojis. Let's begin with the obvious. Israel's Operation Rising Lion was not just a show of force, it was a masterclass in hybrid warfare. Imagine combining chess, poker, and a drone swarm simulator, then adding 30 years of hardened doctrine. This wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about rewriting the narrative of what 21st century air superiority looks like. Israel's doctrine of preemptive deterrence isn't new. It goes back to 1967, when it took out multiple Arab air forces on the ground before breakfast. But in 2025, this doctrine now comes laced with algorithms, satellite relays, and AI that can suggest which roof in Natanz might house the wrong type of centrifuge. The operation's brilliance wasn't only in the F-35 sorties. It was in the symphony of tools working together, decoy drones to confuse Iranian radar, electronic warfare to jam communication, And even rumors of cyber saboteurs who disrupted Iranian-based security camera feeds moments before impact. It's not just shock and awe anymore, it's confuse, blind, overwhelm, then strike with precision. Now, Iran, say what you want about their economic strain or aging air fleet, their response was sharp, fast, and surprisingly coordinated. Operation True Promise 3 was not just symbolic. It was a tactical reminder that Iran doesn't need air superiority when it can field 1,000 drones. Some barely bigger than a pizza box, capable of delivering explosives with frightening accuracy. The use of modified Fateh 110 missiles, blended with Shahed drones, showed a strategic logic. Overwhelm the defense grid, test its edges, and, if lucky, sneak a few through to hit infrastructure and civilian targets that undermine morale. They didn't need to win militarily. They needed to send a message: if you can reach Natanz, we can reach Tel Aviv. So let's talk doctrine. Israel fights like a scalpel. Iran fights like a swarm. Israel invests in airspace dominance, fast deployment, and layered defense, Iron Dome, David's Sling, and now rumored eye-based counter-drone lasers in testing. Iran invests in asymmetric projection, drones, militias, cyber teams, and shipping lanes that can be shut down without warning. But here's the twist. Both sides are increasingly playing each other's game. Israel's use of embedded drones inside Iran, possibly operated by proxy agents, is textbook asymmetric warfare. Iran's attempt to blind Israeli satellites with a suspected laser system in Qom? That's a page from Israel's own playbook of denial and deception. It's almost like they've been studying each other for 40 years. Let's not forget the economic front. The shadow war hit the oil market like a caffeine rush during Ramadan. Futures spiked. Gulf partners got nervous. Russia smiled quietly. The US sent out diplomatic statements that sounded increasingly like, please stop, we have elections coming. And Europe? Europe did what Europe does best: write strongly worded statements and hope the lights stay on in winter. Germany offered mediation. France called for an unled dialogue. Italy tried to organize a cultural peace concert. Nothing stuck. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Both countries got what they wanted. Israel showcased that it can cripple Iran's nuclear ambitions in hours. Iran proved it can bypass layers of Israeli defense to strike urban zones. The strategic score? A painful, cynical draw. But this game is not over. In fact, this was likely a calibration exercise, not an accident. Not even a miscalculation, but a mutual test of thresholds. Israel wanted to know, how much can we hit before the world says no? Iran wanted to know, how far can we retaliate before we get sanctioned harder? Both now know, and the line is clearer than before. Whether that's reassuring or terrifying depends on your taste in coffee. Now, let's talk cyber. This wasn't just bombs and bullets. In the first 72 hours, analysts detected over 40 coordinated cyber incursions tied to both parties. Iranian hacker groups with names like Black Lotus and Ghost of Karbala launched DDoS attacks on Israeli water treatment systems and electric grids. Israeli counter-hack teams responded by infiltrating Iranian banking servers and, according to some leaks, temporarily froze domestic credit card processing. Meanwhile, someone, no one knows who, leaked fake photos of captured Israeli pilots to social media, sparking viral rage and then embarrassment when the images were traced to an old video game. Welcome to modern warfare, where optics are sometimes more powerful than ordnance. And now for the subtle comedy of diplomacy. The UN issued a 3.000-word report. It was read by 5 people. The Arab League condemned all acts of violence, while its members quietly increased security at oil fields. Turkey offered to mediate but only after finishing its internal elections. China said it was closely monitoring. Translation: we're watching, but we're not getting involved unless it hurts Belt and Road. Even Qatar's quiet diplomacy team, known for resolving things with air-conditioned rooms and espresso machines, stayed mostly silent. Perhaps realizing that this wasn't a conflict to be soothed with nice lighting and finger food. In summary, what we just witnessed wasn't a regional war. It was a live-fire stress test between two powers that have been rehearsing this dance for decades. The choreography was deadly, the outcome ambiguous, but the message was loud. In a region where neither side wants war but neither can show weakness. We now live one miscalculation away from catastrophe. Still, for now, the missiles are grounded, the jets have returned to hangars. And diplomats, many of whom hadn't spoken in years, are awkwardly clearing their throats and asking, "So, shall we talk?" This has been Part 2A of WarScope Audio. Stay tuned for Part 2B, where we explore proxy implications, historical parallels, and maybe, just maybe, how this ends without a mushroom cloud or a million-person refugee wave. Or as one anonymous Israeli analyst put it, if we're lucky, we get a new round of Geneva talks. If not, we get a drone in our breakfast. Until next time, welcome back to WarScope Audio. You've made it through the missiles, the drones, the diplomatic tightropes, and the cyber chaos. Now, in Part 2B, we take a final breath and ask, what happens next? Let's start with the long game. This wasn't just a one-week scuffle. It was a public dress rehearsal for a much larger geopolitical contest. Iran and Israel didn't just trade fire, they tested their doctrines, their resilience, and their allies' thresholds, and in doing so, they've reminded the world that the Middle East's old fault lines are alive, armed, and algorithmically optimized. Proxy dynamics are shifting fast. Hezbollah watched carefully and did not move. That silence may have been strategic. Lebanon's economy is on the edge, and opening a second front would have turned pressure into collapse. But don't mistake stillness for surrender. What Hezbollah learned this week will be applied in the next skirmish. With smarter drones and quicker reactions, Hamas, bruised but still ideologically tethered to Tehran, saw proof that direct retaliation by Iran is not fantasy. It's viable, and, if coordinated properly, could support their narrative and logistics in future escalations in Gaza or the West Bank. Then there's the wildcard, Iraq. Iranian-backed militias there are increasingly autonomous, emboldened, and well-armed. They may soon become not just messengers of Iranian intent, but freelancers of chaos. And Israel's intelligence services know that, which is why covert operations in Iraq may rise in the coming months, even if the spotlight shifts elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing the geopolitical equivalent of checking their locks twice before bed. Officially, they call for de-escalation. Unofficially, they're recalculating everything: missile defense procurement, trade routes, energy export paths, even the role of China as a crisis backchanneler. Speaking of China, its silence during the first 72 hours was loud. When it finally spoke, it was vague and distant. But behind that silence, cables were humming. Beijing has deep interests in Iranian oil and Israeli tech. Conflict between its two regional partners is bad for business. Expect future Chinese pressure, not through aircraft carriers, but through loan terms, trade deals, and satellite coverage. And Russia? Russia watched like a chess master watching two impatient players bump each other's elbows. Moscow sees distraction in the Middle East as leverage in Ukraine and Africa. It will now offer discounted air defense systems to Tehran while also quietly praising Israeli precision, a balancing act only a cynic could admire. Now let's zoom out. Historically speaking, this conflict fits a familiar rhythm. In 1981, Israel bombed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in Operation Opera. The world screamed, then it moved on. In 2007, Israel struck a secret Syrian nuclear facility at Deir ez-Zor. Another outcry, another shrug. In both cases, short-term condemnation gave way to long-term strategic acceptance. Will the same happen here? Possibly, but the stakes are higher now. Iran is not Iraq or Syria. It has regional influence, global alliances, and, perhaps most dangerously, the patience to play the long game. Israel, on the other hand, faces a strategic paradox. Every successful strike buys time, but also tightens the spring of future retaliation. The more precise it becomes, the more unpredictable its enemies get. It's like building the perfect lock while your opponent stops using doors. And now for the uncomfortable scenario. What if this week wasn't the war before peace, but the calm before a bigger storm? Imagine this. A proxy group, acting independently, strikes Israeli or U.S. assets in Iraq or the Gulf. Israel responds. Iran denies involvement. The U.S. is drawn in. Unwillingly. NATO gets nervous. Oil prices spike to $120. AUN resolution fails. Turkey mobilizes forces near Syria. China calls for calm, again. Sound far-fetched? It's not. All the pieces are already on the board. So, what would real de-escalation look like? It starts not with summits, but with signals, military deconfliction hotlines, mutual no-fly agreements over sensitive zones, restored IAEA inspections at Natanz and Fordow, A quiet memo from Washington to Tel Aviv saying, "That's enough for now." And perhaps, an even quieter response from Tehran, "We'll wait, but we won't forget." There are lessons to learn, if anyone's still in the mood for learning. Lesson 1. Missile defense works, until it doesn't. Every interception is a miracle of math and physics. But even the best system leaks. And in a region where cities are minutes apart by air, one leak is enough. Lesson 2. Information is now a battlefield. Deepfakes, fake footage, fake press releases, they're not bugs. They're weapons. And the side that controls the narrative often gains more than the side that controls the terrain. Lesson 3. Third parties matter more than ever. Oman, Switzerland, Qatar, they may not have jets, but they have trust. And trust is the rarest currency in any war. Lesson 4. Deterrence isn't about preventing all attacks. It's about shaping your enemy's expectations. If both sides leave this conflict thinking they can predict each other's red lines, we may just survive another decade. And finally, Lesson 5. Wars no longer end with treaties. They end with pauses, strategic intermissions, followed by quieter wars, until one side stops blinking. So, as we close this series, one final thought. The Iran-Israel exchange of June 2025 may not be remembered as a war. But it will be remembered as a warning, a blinking red light on the dashboard of the modern Middle East. A signal that strategy still matters, that restraint is still power, and that even in the age of AI, it's the oldest rules of war, misjudgment, pride, fear, that remain the most dangerous. This has been WarScope Audio. Thank you for listening, for thinking, and for caring about a world where knowing the truth is still the first line of defense. Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your facts straight, and your sarcasm ready. Because when geopolitics gets stupid, someone's got to explain it. That's what we're here for.